Fabulous. Great. So we'll give it a minute for people to join our live here. If you're on time, you get a gold star. It's a cyber gold star. It's not physical, but just know it's happening. And a couple of you who have joined our cybersecurity stand-ups so far will know that I had grand aspirations of telling a joke at the beginning, at the top of every episode. I didn't get around to it last week. And then this week, I went sort of hunting for some good cybersecurity humor. You guys, we have to up our game. So many bad jokes that were just like, and I got them. They're just really poor. So I have one for you this week. It's a little wholesome, but here we go. It's why did the programmer leave the camping trip early? Because there are too many bugs. See what I mean? You're like, okay, fine, I get it, but we got to do better. So if anyone has some better jokes, please get in touch with me as soon as possible.
As a security professional, I want to say that's why they shouldn't leave the campground. They should be sticking around and taking care of those bugs.
You know what? That's a better addition to the joke. Yeah. Okay, wonderful. So we'll dive in here. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Bronwyn Hudson. I'm your host on Cybersecurity Stand Up, and I'm also the social media manager at Upticks. Today, I'm joined by Brian Thomas, Jack Roerig, and Chris Smedberg, and we're going to open this week a little bit differently. I want to do a little lightning round of introductions here because we have some really unique perspectives to be pulling from, some really interesting backgrounds. So we're going to go Brian, and then Chris, and then Jack. Can you guys just give us a couple of lines of introduction about what you're doing now and what your experiences have been when it comes to M&A? Brian, can we start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Brian Thomas. I do marketing program management here at Upticks. So basically, I'm sort of the cat wrangler for our marketing department. And most of my M&A experience is I previously worked at BitSite, which is a security tool that is frequently used in M&A to assess a company's cybersecurity posture and their program. And I did work in marketing, but I worked with some really great experts in the field and practitioners to do a lot of research, interviewed a lot of CISOs, and really got interested in learning this in the space. And I hope learned a lot about some best practices and what CISOs need to be aware of as they enter into M&A transactions.
Love it. Absolutely. Chris, let's go to you.
Yeah, and pleasure to be here today. Chris Smedberg, Director of Cybersecurity for Advance. People probably don't know the name Advance, but you know us by our portfolio companies. Just to list two to give people some footing: Condé Nast and Ironman, the triathlon company. So current role is really split across providing security for corporate and then enabling, advising our portfolio. But the corporate piece has a big part of M&A, both as we look to grow our individual portfolio companies as well as look to add additional what we call tentpole companies. And then prior to that, actually participated in a few M&As of probably conservatively Fortune 50 companies. So I've had both sides of it, very large public M&A as well as the private space for my current role.
Huge variety of experience there. Fascinating. And Jack, can you give us a couple of lines about your experience with M&A too?
Yeah. So I started with M&A like 15 years ago or something like that. I was in a very similar position to Chris. I worked for a conglomerate, a public conglomerate, and we would buy and sell companies. Um, like someone at the flea market was buying and selling compact discs. Is that a thing still? I know Chris because I worked at Turn It In, and you bought us, right? I don't know if you were there
We
when
do have some mutual M&A experience right there.
Yeah, and we've worked together on some acquisitions. Chris is much smarter than I am, but currently, right now, of course, you all know me as the technology evangelist of Upticks, a position that chose me. Not one that I chose. It's kind of like the thing that somebody told me about. And I was like, I just have to do this because Upticks is not only an awesome tool for M&A, but it's my life now.
You're divinely called.
I've seen the light.
Awesome. That's really great. I'm excited to hear about these different perspectives of from like the company that was acquired to the company that's doing the acquiring. It's really cool to have sort of both perspectives in this conversation right now. Really cool. But I think I want to jump in with this term that is floating around so much in M&A, which is due diligence. And I want to jump into basically what that means. What is cyber due diligence? What is encompass? What are we even talking about? How can we be good at it? Who's involved with the decisions? There are so many parts to this that I want to dissect. But Chris, can I start with you for this question? Like, what is cyber due diligence? What does that really encompass?
Yeah, can go a million different directions with it, and a lot of that is due to every M&A being different. There's different business reasons. There's you might be merging two different industries. You might be buying somebody just for their book of business. But ultimately, for me, cyber due diligence is just arming the business team with the information to make the right informed decision on whether the acquisition makes sense. And to me, it's really twofold. It's making a determination on likelihood that there are existing security issues that could, pop up later and cause you pain and financial trouble. And then ballparking what the remediation costs would be. So knowing where your goalposts are for what you need the target's cyber maturity to be, understanding their current state, and then estimating what that remediation cost is, so that the business team can make decisions with both of those factors in mind. Right? They need to be able to take into account the post close cost that they're going to incur, as well as the breach likelihood side, to evaluate from a risk perspective.
Brian, can you add to that? As I feel like one of the main things we've talked about too is the difference essentially in like language and expectation that happens between these disparate fields of business and tech.
Yeah. So, something that comes up a lot is, especially when you're talking with new CISOs or CISOs that are doing this for the first time, is there's sort of this mismatch between what CISOs feel prepared to talk about or how they're communicating what's important versus the board's ability to absorb that information and what feels actionable to them. So, sort of I think the genius insight that Stephen Boyer and Nagarjuna at BitSite had was understanding that, business leaders are used to seeing things in terms of like FICO scores or Moody's ratings. And they figured out how to communicate cyber risk in those terms. And, you can debate the utility of something like a BitSite rating because, it can only see things that are externally observable. And, but business leaders love it. Something we used to hear all the time, though, from security leaders is, they didn't always agree with BitSite's findings. But, it's sort of, I think, a challenge that CISOs have to figure out is, if you don't want your M&A security strategy being dictated to you by BitSite or Security Scorecard or these ratings companies, how do you communicate risk to the board and to executives in terms that they are able to like understand, digest, and that feel actionable to them, so that basically they know what they're going to get for the spend that you're asking them for.
Jack, I want to hear you weigh in on that one.
Okay, here's my take. I've always heard my buddies who don't work in tech or don't work, they talk about this guy Warren Buffett. Like Warren Buffett invests in the stock market and he makes all this money, and I'm like, no. What Warren Buffett is doing is he's identifying companies that have operating problems that he can solve or that his team can solve, right? That's the fundamental behind like an acquisition is if I'm going to acquire a company or advise a company, I see some unique potential to where I can influence that company to be a better company. When I worked with Chris when he at Advance and Turn It In, we bought Iron Man. And it was so orthogonal to the portfolio of companies we managed. But for some reason, we were much better at operating Ironman than other people were. It made more sense. You take that a step further to it, like, advising companies. Um, when you get really good at security, you're an authority. You can see things that are easy for you. You can give better feedback. Now, breaking that all down into M&A, when you're a CISO and you get pulled into M&A, think about that, right? You're trying to acquire a company for as little money as possible and operate it better than the people who previously owned it. They're selling it because they don't, they value it less than we're paying for it. So what do people want to hear in the M&A process? They want to hear about things that are going to be able to be used to negotiate the price of the company down, that we're good at solving. If we have a world-class security team and they have a security deficit, then when we acquire that company, we can mention, say, you don't have, we have to make all the security investment post acquisition. So you should take this, cost into consideration, in addition to the P&L and all the risks, reduce the price of the company. And then it's easier and cheaper for a company with a well-established security team to build a security program for a company that doesn't have one. And if you've ever been involved in M&A, one of the common themes is that these companies don't have security programs because before you sell a company, you tend to eliminate operating expenses, and unfortunately, we're the first to go.
Which seems dangerous, right? I mean, we're teeing ourselves up. If you're the company being acquired, there's so much vulnerability, right? There's so much risk that's latent, that's like right there. Um, Chris, I mean, I'd love to hear your sort of perspective on that, because if you're acquiring, yeah, I mean, jump in.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right. Obviously, if you're cutting security spend, security investment, you are just inherently increasing your risk of a cyber event occurring. I don't, as the acquirer, I don't know how much I care about that, um, depending on what the actual business goal of the acquisition is. Um, so I think that is just such an important input as the security lead in the due diligence. I think I mentioned it earlier, but it's very different if I'm buying a company with the intention of integrating the networks or integrating the products, versus buying a company that I'm basically going to dissolve. Right, I'm just going to convert their customers to my product.
Or
Um,
operate autonomously too. That's something that Advanced does a lot, right? A lot of times you buy a company, but there's gotchas there. I can see a.
well, I would just say that just lives somewhere in the middle. Then, right? I care about security because there is um, a like perpetual risk associated with it. There's not this line I'm drawing in the sand of when that company's going to go away or that risk is going to go away. But it's also not to the degree of you know this thing is now going to sit on a flat network with the rest of my system, and any risk they have, I'm now exposing my likely larger company to.
That's fascinating. I think one of the things that gets brought up too is that there's so much conversational focus on the legal parts of this, on the financial aspects, and then cyber, because it's maybe been eliminated by the company that's being acquired. That part of the conversation comes in last minute. That comes in as like either an afterthought or something that happens too late in the game. I mean, Brian, do you have thoughts on basically like how can we bring the conversation of cyber due diligence like earlier in the process? Can it be earlier in the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's if you kind of step back and look at a lot of acquisition process, right? Like a lot of focus is on uh, with board and business leaders on the upfront risk with P&L, like operating costs, things like that. But I think there's a pretty long-term risk concentration in cyber. If you look at what happened with like Marriott and Starwood acquisition, like that demon reared its ugly head like quite a long way down the road. But again, I think it kind of goes back to the point that we've been sort of talking around, which is sort of stepping up to the leadership table in a way that you can communicate risk and kind of talk in a language that the business leaders that are leading this process need to hear and are prepared to hear. So, if you lead with tech, you can kind of end up in these, hour-long debates about what DNS means and, things that are kind of like trivial and don't really
You
lead
won't
to a
get
whole lot of
invited.
outcomes.
You
Yeah,
don't get invited
exactly.
back to the
That
party.
that might be your last meeting with the board if that's how your conversation goes. So, I think it's just showing up with like very simple, easy to understand points that are actionable and that make the board feel confident that they are making an informed decision based on the information that you are presenting them.
And that they
That I think
care.
is good advice. Go ahead, Jack.
Like, so they like imagine that you're working with a board who is planning on being on a different board in 2 years, right?
Right.
They don't care about the long term risks. They're not worried about what's going to happen to the company 3 years after they've left. Depending on their stock alignments and all that. But I've seen this a lot where there's 4 year cycles in the private equity acquisition process, right? Chris, is about 4 years typically, not for advance, but
That's probably a fair generalization of the
yeah.
industry. Yes.
Yeah. So the idea is you buy a company, you invest in it for 4 years, and you flip it, right? And so if you go in there and you start talking about 10-year risk, 15-year risk, they're kind of like, what they want to do is they want to keep the thing safe for the period that they're operating it, and then they want to optimize the operational expenses at the very end there and flip it, right? There's a lot of people that flip companies. That's one kind of intention of the M&A, the people making the M&A decisions. So you really have to think about what is it that they're really trying to do, and how can I appeal to the concerns that they should have. They're not going to tell you what those things are, but you should be able to get an idea of, do they want to hold the company for 4 years? Do they want to invest indefinitely with a variable runway? Are they acquiring the company for the books, as Chris mentioned, is a possibility? And if they're not going to integrate the companies, and Chris was saying this as well, right? It's not like just because the companies aren't integrated doesn't mean the data science team isn't going to be jumping all over that new company's data, right? So it's a lot about just managing perception and understanding your audience, and those are things that CISOs tend to need a little help with. I think the best way to approach that as a CISO is trust yourself. Like, you do know those things. You do know how to appeal to audience. Don't doubt yourself. CISOs have a lot of self doubt, and they go and they want to prove themselves technically. They want to prove that they know what they're doing. You're the freaking CISO, right? You know what you're doing. Assume that everybody in the room respects that. And if they don't, that's their bad. You don't need to talk tech. You don't need to prove these little things. You just need to be confident.
Yeah, I mean, Jack, the last two points you made, I think they dance around the same thing, and it really is, how do you align security with the business, so that your opinion, your voice, and your conclusions are actually taken into consideration. And I think that's a really good point that people can take away, is just a slight different way you position a finding. If you position it just technical, this is a security framework, this is where, what I found they're currently doing does not align with industry best practice, versus, you know, this is the same finding, but it could inhibit our goals of, being able to protect the value of this business over whatever that
It, it,
horizon is.
Can I ask you? You can tell me no. You wrote a report for me, and not to include any details in this report, but
Yeah, yeah.
so when Chris and I worked together, he wrote this risk analysis report, a breach risk analysis report, and it was gold. I sent this report to everybody 100 times because he is so much better at this than I am. And what he had done is he had taken and expressed the risk of, like, here's what happens if we're breached. This is why we need to invest in these risk mitigation efforts. And it considered the audience. Like, how do you know how to do that?
you know uh just intuitive, right? um but no, I think a lot of it is experience, and just knowing what has been received well. So trial and error. I do think risk and getting down to dollar amounts is a universal language across the business. Now, I would caution, I've seen people quantify risk down to an exaggeration, but the pennies. You just get laughed out of there, right? Nobody can be that precise with their
Sig
risk
figs.
calculation.
It's called
Yeah,
sig figs. Yeah.
yeah, just big ballpark ones. But I do think a lot of people have the mindset of, I know cybersecurity risk is real, um, but it's not going to happen to me. And even if it did, we'd survive because we see attacks all the time, and those companies are still around. Um, but I think people struggle with being able to quantify what that like big bang impact would be. When realistically, it's quite easy. I mean, what Jack's referencing, what I did for them was get a pretty close estimate of the total number of sensitive records that were at risk, and you
He
use.
asked me like 3 questions, and he came back with this phenomenal report. And Chris, I just want to, sorry to interrupt you, but I want to say, you know how I did it? I trusted you. Right? That's it's a really key takeaway here because you can't do this alone, right? Like, I know Chris is really good at this. When he sent me this thing, I knew it was gold, right? And I, I mean, I learned a ton from him there, right? Always be learning. Like, the M&A process can feel very secretive at times, but Chris, like, it just came so naturally to you, but it's something that I have a very hard time expressing it. And so by teaming up with Chris and by using his report, he enabled me tremendously.
Yeah, no, I'm glad it was of value. But I think just to give people a little bit more insight into what we're talking around, it was basically using total sensitive records, Ponymon Institute estimates of cost per record breach, and then taking conservative estimates based on what I knew about the business, the systems, on what the um, a reasonably likely scenario would lead to, right? What percentage of the data set would be impacted, and even with conservative numbers, that number that you come up with can be quite eye-opening. I don't know
But
what the
also,
cost per record is right now, but it's got to be what, 400, 450, probably.
it would have been a total PR nightmare. We would have been destroyed. But the data you came up with was non-actuarial in terms of like the standards of what an insurance company would expect. Whereas Brian, you have experience with BitSight, and BitSight's data is
Mhm.
much closer to following a standard framework that is, yeah, objective, right? Like, so that comes
Yeah,
in a little differently.
yeah, it's basically based on how like FICO or other credit companies would model their scores. So it has to be externally verifiable. Like a third party outside of BitSight would have to be able to come in and like see it and verify it. And like that's great because it sort of allows you to comp between different companies and compare different companies' cybersecurity posture to each other. The problem you're going to run into though is like anything that is not internet facing or is not externally verifiable, BitSight can't, or Security Scorecard or any of these other ratings companies can't give you insight into that or quantify it for you or even tell you that it's there. And that's where I think the fact that they've made it so easy for business leaders to digest this information is great, but it's also sort of the Achilles heel, right? Because it can give sort of a rosier picture of risk than you might actually be facing if you're not doing the sort of deep dive that you and Chris were just discussing.
And
I have
I'll add,
yeah, go
just
ahead, Chris.
for lack of naming all the tools in the space, let's just assume BitSight, invaluable tool in my belt for M&A, especially smaller acquisitions. Security does not have a ton of time to do the due diligence. So I use a tool like BitSight to take a where there's smoke, there's fire approach. I don't
Mhm.
take the ratings and think they're gold, they're perfect. But if the rating is looking really bad in one area, there's likely something to dig into there. So I'll focus my team's time in that area.
What about just the assumption that there's almost always some security risk that's major when you acquire a company? It's almost par. What I like to do is try and find proof that that exists, and irrefutable proof. At one time, I requested company policies in security, and I think half of them were just lorem ipsum. Like somebody accidentally just sent them over in their with just all lorem ipsum. And I'm like, that's a weird policy, right? Yeah, Chris, we worked on that company together.
Yeah, that one rang a bell.
Oh no. I'm sure there's like major failure stories there and major success stories there that are just like underneath the surface right here.
That was a success. We identified an opportunity to make an easy improvement.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Um, Before we wrap up here, guys, I want to ask if there are resources that you would recommend to our audience. So, obviously, Chris, you say that a lot of this comes from experience, but if people are looking to just learn more, are there policies? Are there sites? Are there companies? What can you recommend broadly?
Yeah, so I don't think there's a specific resource I would point people to, but just to share a little bit what high level process is. Um, I use the CIS framework for both my own company as well as across the portfolio, and that's what we use for M&A. So it's going through or using a framework to ground yourself, then going through what you know about the business you're targeting, what the actual goals of the business team are with that, and starting to check things off. This one's really important. This one's irrelevant, so that you can get down to a smaller list that you can actually focus time on. But framework as your starting place gives you some confidence that you're not overlooking a key area of security that might be a blind spot for you. And to Jack's point, I think that allows you to walk into the conversation just with a lot more confidence.
Smart. Very smart.
Yeah, yeah, and it's what I really like that answer, but I also like to just tell put the onus on the acquiring the target company and say, give me everything you got. Like, show me all the evidence that you have an effective security program, but definitely have the baseline right. Definitely apply a framework. But if you give them the opportunity to chime in and say, here, but we've also done this thing, then you can if you've given them every chance to prove their security program to you and you're given a bunch of junk, you can make a pretty good assumption there. But those two things accomplish two different goals, right? Using a framework to come up with a consistent rating on the business or bit site, right, Brian? Like,
Yeah.
this is great. It's a great negotiation token. That's the most valuable thing you got right there. The additional thing that you're kind of seeding in there by asking for all the security attestation is it's setting your stage to ask for budget once the company is acquired so that you can build the program that the company needs. um,
Interesting.
it, yeah, it kind of preempts that conversation.
So you're forecasting in that way as well. That's interesting.
Yeah, there's the whole let's get this company's value down so we can get it cheap. There's exposing the risks to high level to the board, and then there's trying to find some wildly ridiculous stuff so that you can be like, come on, man, you remember this? And the CEO's like, yeah, I know. Okay, you can have the $800,000 for that, right? Like it works.
And that's the fine art of negotiation, it sounds like that, that's common across all industries.
It totally is. Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you so much for being here. I feel like we could go so much deeper on this topic, so I think we might have to do a part 2 on this one because I feel like we've barely scratched the surface on a lot of these topics, but does anyone have any closing thoughts, advice, points of view they'd like to share before we wrap up here?
I'd say I'd be happy to do a part 2. I'd be very
In.
interested to talk with the group just around novel ways to increase the effectiveness of your due diligence while lowering your effort. Just BitSite's one tool, but I think there's some other spaces that we should be looking at as security professionals to do that for us.
And what does the audience want to hear about too? That's one of the things. You want to know about how to break into advisory. You want to know about how to break into like one of those angel syndicates or get into private equity investing. These are all things that are very M&A centric. Brian, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear, questions that the audience has, or things that are on your mind. It's always great to hear what people are concerned about, as well as kind of what skills or things people want to know to advance their careers. That's kind of why we're here, is to help you be more effective at your job. That's why we do what we do, and we're always eager to listen.
And
Yeah.
if you want intros, if you want help, you
Yep.
can always reach out to me. I'm not going to throw everybody else on the spot, but I'm Upticks Evangelist, which means I'm here to help anybody who has any interest in Upticks. So Jack at jackroerig.com or jroerig at upticks.com. You want an intro to a company's CEO or something like that? You want some tips on getting into advisory or in an angel syndicate? Just let me know.
Love that plug. Yeah, please feel free to connect with all of us on LinkedIn. I know actually Jack just put up a two-parter post that works really well with this conversation. It was called 14 Requests Security Leaders Should Use for M&A Due Diligence. It is a list. It is a list of questions and requests that Jack has used as a framework to reach out to companies and like get all of the documents that give me everything, but a list of how to do that. So let's pin this for a part 2, because Chris, I really want to hear about some of your ideas for novel ways to approach this conversation as well. And to the audience, please let us know who you would like to hear from as well, and other questions you want covered. And we also have a blog coming out about this topic if anyone wants to kind of dial it back, get into the very sort of like surface level, and also, we'll dive into what M&A actually is from a cybersecurity perspective as well. As a little preview for next week, we're totally diverting topics in preparation for KubeCon in Europe. We're talking about Kubernetes, so feel free to keep an eye out for that invitation, and also let us know what questions you'd like covered in that topic. For now, huge thank you to our guests, especially Chris, for joining us on this one. We really look forward to having you back for a part 2, and we will see you out in cyberspace. Thank you so much for joining, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Bye, guys.
you.